Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, or good middle of the night, depending on when you're watching this. This is our first lecture in logic, and I want to talk to you about logic in general and what I think it is. And I want to orient you to how I approach it. And the first thing we'll do in thinking about that is to consider this quote from Plato. Plato said that wonder is the pathos of the philosopher. Now, pathos means your emotional state, right? But when an emotional state overtakes you and sort of becomes who you are, right? Think about a moment when you're angry, right? It's like you get possessed with anger. That's how the ancients thought about it. You're just sort of possessed with anger, and it defines who you are. Or you could be so happy, right? Like how happy I'm going to be when this freaking pandemic is over, and I can talk to people like you in person and see your faces instead of talking to a funny little webcam, right? Then I'll be filled with the pathos of happiness and a kind of joy. Well, Plato here says that wonder is the pathos of the philosopher. That wonder is what happens to the philosopher. And there's a great German word for pathos, or that sums up what pathos is, and it's called Stimmung. In German, an emotion is called a Stimmung, but we could translate it as an attunement. Like when you take two tuning forks and you put them next to each other and you bond one and the other one will start vibrating in sympathy, right? So in the same way, we can have a sort of emotional state that comes out of an attunement to our environment around us, right? So if we think about that wonder is the guiding passion of the philosopher. And philosophy, he says, has its arche in wonder. Now, arche is a Greek word that means something like a beginning or a ruler, a beginning that rules, or what we might call a guiding principle. So, an arche is a principle or a beginning that guides and rules over who we are. So think about what Plato is saying here, that philosophy's beginning is found in this sort of pathos of wonder or astonishment at what we find in the world. And it's also one of its guiding principles, which means it's what's never left behind in being a philosopher. It's something that guides and fills every step of the way. Wonder is what happens to the philosopher, and it guides and shapes them and rules over all their activities. And what does wonder do? Well, it fills you with questions. And when you're filled with questions, right, you turn to knowledge if you're a philosopher, right? That's another guiding principle that's always there at the origins of philosophy, that it's a wonder that's shaped by knowledge in the sense of reason or thinking. Philosophers wondered at the world. And then in response, they didn't make a myth, they didn't think about gods, they didn't write poetry, though they could have, but they reasoned about it, they thought about it, they tried to make sense of it by thinking. And at the heart of this root of wonder and astonishment, then, is what we call mind, our mind, right? Just think of how astonishing it is to live and be aware of it and to know it. To be aware of your own existence. To know that you know and that you live in this world. Or just to know that you know anything at all. Think about it for a minute. I look at this object, right? I'm looking at it. I'm aware of it. But now I can step back. And I can be aware that I'm aware of this object. I'm aware that I'm aware of something. And then even stranger, if you pay close attention, you realize that you can become aware that you're aware of being aware of the object. And I can be aware of my own awareness, and I know that I know. And this awareness of being aware is what we mean by mind or consciousness. mind is the most astonishing thing of all. Right? Mind, in a way, is astonishment, a sort of self-opening to being. Mind takes many forms, ranging from simple self-awareness to like when I look at the pen, and then I know that I know the pen, something very simple, right? Or I know that I am aware of being alive. I'm aware of my awareness, so simple, and yet so subtle and wonderful, right? But it can range from that wonderful, simple awareness to what we call reason or thinking and argument. And it's all found in wonder and terror. In my mind, philosophy begins in wonder and terror, when we stand in astonishment at what we find in the world. For what Black Elk, the great Lakota Indian or Native American philosopher, called the beauty and strangeness of the earth. And in considering the wonder and terror and the beauty and strangeness of the earth, I think we find the origin of all real thought, the experiences that shake you right out of received notions of reality, notions that you've received from your culture, from your teachers and parents, and from the media, and from the books you've read, and from what your professors tell you. They tell you all kinds of ways to think about reality and to deal with the wonder of being aware that you're aware when you're faced with wonder and terror, right? And when you have these experiences of wonder and terror, they put you in the place that is in between the gap, right? It puts you in the gap, in that place between how your culture tells you reality is and the direct experience you're having of it, which can give rise to wonder or terror in the face of all the beauty and the strangeness of the earth. I always think of one of my first experiences of really being shaken in that way. It was when I was in 7th grade, and in middle school, I think you call it now, right? We didn't call it that, right? And I would go early and sit in the library because I took a bus, and the bus arrived early, and I'd sit in the library because folks would pick on me. I had long hair, and I was a little hippie, I guess. Yeah, and people would pick on you there in the Deep South. So in any case, I'd go in the library, and I'm sitting in the library one day, and I look over and see a book with a strange title on the shelf. It said The Holocaust. Now you have to understand that when the schools I went to in Louisiana, which are still about 48 or 49th in the nation, I'd received no knowledge or information about the Holocaust. All I knew about it were some vague notions from watching World War II movies. And we'd never had things like Elie Wiesel's Night in our curriculum, and there was no Holocaust museum. And if nobody talked about it and you weren't Jewish, you just didn't come across it, right? Me and my Southern religious context. And I took that book over off the shelf and started looking at it. And I saw the pictures. And you know the pictures I mean. The pictures of the bodies, and the pictures of the ovens, and the pictures of the piles of clothes and glasses from the victims that they were sorting out, and on and on and on. And even the pictures of the prisoners when the camps were liberated. And one of the pictures I would find out later that I was looking at was a picture of someone who had become a friend of mine, a man named Elie Wiesel, who taught at Eckerd during winter term, and I knew him for over 20 years. He became a friend. And he told me about what it was like to be where that picture was. And anyway, back there in middle school, my little strange self, I felt terror, because it seemed like the world was nothing like what people had told me it was, with a loving God who was in charge of everything, and where everybody understood what everything was. For a moment there, I entered the gap between what my society told me was real and how to understand it, and a sort of direct experience that made me question everything I had ever been told, And those questions led me to try to think and to find reasons and facts and evidence to make sense of it. But it needn't be something so terrible. It can also be wonder, right? One of the clearest experiences of wonder I think I've ever had was seeing my children being born. Another human life coming out of my wife. What an astonishment. And all the words you're told about it, reproduction and species survival and all the biological processes and so on, they didn't seem to encapsulate what it meant to see that small being coming out of another human being and to hold it in my arms. And it filled me with wonder and put me in the gap. It filled me with questions that I wanted answers for, and reasons, and evidence, and thinking, right? Because always in philosophy, we're interested in thinking and not believing. But what does it mean to think? What is the experience we call thinking? What is thought? What is reason? You're always hearing people mention it. By thinking, I mean something in particular that we can identify and point to. Another word for it is an ancient one, from the Greek, logos. In English, Logos. Logos. So I don't just mean thinking in general. Say it's anything that's going on in your head. I could ask you right now to think of the letter A or the letter Z, and you would picture something in your mind that was peculiar to you. I don't know what kind of A you're thinking of or Z you're thinking of. And that's a psychological process. But it's not reasoning in the sense of logos. You could remember something. You could remember what you had for breakfast. Or you could imagine that this class, strange as it is, was already over. So of course, you could make it over for yourself anytime you want. I would never know it. You could just switch it off. What a strange thing, isn't it, to be having a class this way, right? Or, while you're listening to my video, right, you could just daydream, moving from one image to another, while your teacher's voice drones on and on and on, talking. Well, all of these are psychological processes which can be empirically studied by psychologists and cognitive scientists, but none of these are thinking in the sense of the word logos. If I asked you to think about a problem in math, we might seem to be getting closer. When we solve a problem, we seem to think about it. Think about an equation. 2x plus y equals 20. 2x plus y equals 20. Define x to be 5 and y to be 10 seems to think in a way. But still, when we look at the mental process that goes on in solving the problem, it can be highly idiosyncratic. It can involve guesses, emotion, if you hate math, right? Trial and error. And I think here I'm trying to explain algebra to my children at various times in their lives when they were growing up. Or sometimes, I don't know about you, but the answer just seems to come out of nowhere. That would happen to me all the time in algebra class, and the teacher would say to show your work, and I couldn't show my work because I just knew the answer, and I didn't know how to explain how I got it, and for some reason that would make the teacher exasperated with me. Or solving that problem, or any problem in math, can simply involve trained habits of following certain rules that you've memorized to generate an answer. Those are called algorithms, right? Where you just sort of mechanically plop stuff in and do it in a certain way. And that's something that monkeys can be trained to do, right? Algorithms, right? Memorize procedures and train habits, but that's not thinking. Thinking as logos points to something that stands beyond these idiosyncrasies. it seems to stand before these idiosyncrasies. First, we must be aware of something in a certain way before we could even begin to do the algorithms. You have to recognize the patterns before you can manipulate them. What lies beneath or before the algorithms stands outside the experience of particularity or idiosyncrasy. Now, idiosyncrasy is an interesting word. Let's look at it for a second. So consider with me here the word idiosyncrasy, which means a characteristic peculiarity of habit or structure. Now, this word comes from the Greek, where idio means private, and syncrasy means action, right? How idiosyncratic, we say, of someone who has some peculiar private habit, or that it's something they always do in their own particular way, right? Private actions, private ways of doing things. The actions of one, the Greeks called, and here you can see the word, idiotes. I love that word. And it's the root word of one you might recognize, but it doesn't quite mean that. It doesn't mean what we mean when we say an idiot, though you can see how it's derived from it. By an idiotes, the Greeks meant not a stupid person, but one who is locked into his or her own private perspective, right? That you're just sort of locked into your private opinions of something. And the opposite of being an idiotes is to be one who pays attention to the patterns or structures that are common to everyone in different realms of experience. And that's the sophos, the one who knows, or the public person. The idiotes is the private person, locked into their private perspectives. And the sophos is the one who is aware of the broad patterns that cut across our individual levels of experience, right? Something identified by that word logos, the root word from which we identify logic. Now, in ancient Greek, logos could mean many things, right? It's one of those words that has many shades of meaning. A logos is just a word, but it could also mean a language. English is a logos, but the word language is a logos too. And then it could mean a saying or a statement, right? Or it could mean a speech, like the Greeks would say, I'm giving you a logos right now. And then from that, by meaning extension, it comes to mean a proposition in the sense of thought or reason, right? When you give an account or a reckoning of something. And now we're beginning to get at what we mean by logic, right? Now, you'll watch me screw up now and again in these videos, just like you would if you were watching me live. And I'll be damned if I'm going to edit them out. Well, yeah, I'm just not. So let's carry on, right? Now, all of these things, having words, having language, making statements, having speeches, having conversations, stating a proposition, and will come to mean something very exact by proposition. All of these things were thought to be the things that made us human, that defined what it meant to be a human being. Perhaps you've heard one of the oldest definitions of what a human being is. The human being is a rational animal, and that's attributed to Aristotle. But Aristotle never actually said that. What he said was, logon daimonon anthropos, eke ton zoon, which could be more accurately translated as, among the living creatures, only the human being has the logos, this ability to reason. But we want to know what that means. What does it mean to reason, right? What does it mean to have the logos? And here we can find a clue by pushing back the history of the word a little further. Logos is a word derived from the word Lego, which originally meant to pick out. To pick out, like, say, on my desk, I picked out this pen, right? There was a pen, and I picked it out, right? And together, pick it up, like I picked up the pen. And now I've let go. I picked up another one. So I've gathered to pick them up, and now I can count them. Oh, 1, 2. Well, actually, they're mechanical pencils. And then I can tell you, yeah, I can recount it and tell it over again. I picked up 2 mechanical pencils. Right? Now, this was the word that the Greeks used when they went to pick olives, to take in the crops. You go out to look at the olive trees, and you pick out the ripe olives from the ones that are not ripe. And you pick out the ripe ones and put them in baskets, right? You've picked them out, and you've gathered them up. And then you take them into your shed, I guess. And after you've got so many bushels or barrels or whatever you have of olives, you can Lego, you can count them up, and then you can go and say to your friend or to the person you want to sell them to, you can recount it, Lego. Oh, I've got 3 barrels of ripe olives. Right? And the idea is that in this ability to think, to have the logos, you can tell what is same and different, right? You can tell the ripe from the unripe, and you can pick them out, and you can think about them. You can count them. You can recount to others what you've found, and you can remember all that. Right? And a new kind of awareness dawns, and you can begin to see things in a new way, the human way. This is like this, and this is not like that, and I know it. And I know that I know it. And then you can gather up what is like and unlike and count it up. And then you can then recount what you've gathered. And you can then hold it in your memory and retell it again and again and again. You can tell a story of the patterns. You can give the logos. And you can experience a self-awareness that engages the world and tells us something new about it that has both a past and a future that can be remembered and talked about and thought about in a new way. From the many things which seem so different, we begin to distinguish the ones, the unities, and we see the logos. This, we say, is like this and not like that. We understand what is same and what is different and can speak about it. Logos was also the word the Greeks used when thinking in terms of what we call a ratio. The Latin translation of the Greek word logos is when we might say 1:4, 1/4, or as the apple is to the earth. Right? Newton's thinking, the apple falls. Right? And as the apple is to the earth, so is the moon to the earth. The moon is falling around the earth. Right? Right? As the apple is to the earth, so is the moon to the earth. And as the moon is to the earth, so is the earth to the sun. Or as 4 is to 8, so is 2 to 4, or 1 to 2. Think about it. When we're giving the ratio, or giving the logos, we can think the moon is to the earth as the earth is to the sun. 4 is to 8 as 2 is to 4. Or we could think all humans are mortals. All mortals are creatures who will die. So all humans are creatures who will die, sadly. And if you didn't know that, now I'm telling you this sad truth for the first time, right? But we can see patterns there, right? This argument has a pattern. The pattern is all A or B, all B or C, so all A or C. So in that argument, that particular argument, we can see a pattern that we could use for many different arguments, right? And any time all A or B and all B or C, all A or C, whatever, A or B are. And when we have the experience of doing this, there's a gathering of thought which can be held in memory. Something like Newton's theory of gravitation can become a permanent possession of the human race, which we can tell from one generation to another. Or on a more modest but no less important scale, the same is true of the syllogism, which you will spend a lot of time learning about this semester. The syllogism is a type of argument, like the one we just looked at with the mortals and the humans. Right? And it too has become a permanent possession of the human race that we can remember and retell and recount and use to think about the world. Right? So in logic, we key into the common patterns we hold in memory and begin to enter the broad world of the Logos. Now in the 6th century BCE, the great Greek philosopher Heraclitus said something that sums this up for me. Read along with me here. Of the Logos, which is as I describe it, men always prove to be uncomprehending, both before they have heard it and when once they have heard it. For although all things happen according to this Logos, men are like people of no experience, even when they experience such words and deeds as I explain, when I distinguish each thing according to its constitution and declare how it is. But the rest of the men fail to notice what they do after they wake up, just as they forget what they do when asleep. To those who are awake, there's one ordered universe common to all, whereas in sleep, each turns away from the world to one of his own. Therefore it is necessary to follow the common. But although the Logos is common, the many live as though they had a private understanding. So listening not to me, but to the Logos, it's wise to agree with me. First, he says, everything happens according to this Logos, right? Everything. Through it, he can distinguish each thing according to its makeup or constitution and declare how it is. He can explain things through the Logos, he says, but most people are like sleepers even when they seem to be awake. They seem to be dreaming. Most people are not awake to the common world, but are like sleepwalkers because they do not know this Logos. The Logos, he adds, is common, but most people live as with a private understanding. Like dreamers. They live, he says, in the Greek, like an idiotes. Think about watching somebody dream. In their dreams, they think they're in a real place. They think they're in the common world, but they're really locked up inside their minds, right? Inside their own fantasies. And this is what Logos helps us to cut out of, right? To escape from, right? Think about any professional person versus a lay person in a particular field of knowledge. For example, think about a doctor and me. When I was a freshman in college at Louisiana State University, I developed a small rash on my arm. And it was at first small, not too bothersome. Then it began to grow. And it itched, and it sort of began to, weep, as they call it, get the liquidy, yeah. And it really began to freak me out. I'm only 18 years old, right? So I began to wear long sleeve shirts. I'd ask people close, what do you think I should do with that? And they'd say, scrub it with soap. I'd scrub it with soap. And it'd get worse. And I call up my dad. What should I, my mom, I called my mom, what should I do? Put some alcohol on it. Well, that made it really worse. Then I even went to the clinic. I go to the clinic doctor. And, what they tell me doesn't make it any better. So finally, in desperation, I call up my dad. Dad, what should I do? And he sent me $100 through the mail, and I went to a dermatologist. When I went into the dermatologist's office, he took one look at it. And he said, oh, it's this. I'll give you this cream. Don't take any hot showers for a few days. Put the cream on it, and it'll be gone. And it was. All right. Now, for me, my symptoms were a phenomenon I could not understand. Right? And so too, apparently, for my mom, my friends, and the clinic doctors. Right? But for the dermatologist, the symptoms on my skin, what he could see, revealed a pattern common to all humans with similar problems. Right? I knew my skin, but the doctor knew skin in general, any human being's skin. As his very title showed, dermatologist. That word logos is in there. Dermata means skin. And logist, right, that comes from logos. The logic of it, the logos, the patterning, right? The dermatologist is one who knows the logos of the skin. A view of it I'm thinking, do I have leprosy? Have Venetian lung rot? What's going on? Spores fly through the air and land. What's going to happen to my skin? Right? I knew those feelings quite well. The feelings of embarrassment and panic and frustration. Right? That was idiosyncratic. Right? Idiotes, locked in my private world. But the doctor was a sophist who had the logos of the skin. And I was like a dreamer when I looked at my skin, when I gave my idiosyncratic opinions of the rash, and so were my friends and the nurses, and even the intern in the clinic. We were locked up in a private world of opinion. But the doctor could listen to the logos of the skin, as his very title indicated, dermatologist. And he was a sophos. Now, when you have a self-awareness like this, you key into a world that is common to all who can think, who can move beyond private things, who can move beyond the self-awareness of particularity to the great common world Heraclitus called the world of the logos, the world of the mind, the world of reason, open to anyone who takes the time and trouble to cultivate this awareness. And in this world, private opinions don't matter. You may say you think that such and such is true. And in the common world of reason, other men and women of reason will be free to question you. And you will then need to give reasons for what you think. Why do you say this? Right? Do you have evidence? Is this an argument? What are your premises? What is your conclusion? What is the form of your argument? Does it have a valid form? Are your statements consistent? Are they contradictory? Are you trying to think? Or are you merely giving me your opinions like you were some kind of dreamer? Which is another way to ask, are you in the common world of knowledge? Are you listening to the logos? Or might you be an idiotes, dreaming something to be real when it's not, living as though you had a private understanding? Are you really listening to the logos we hold in common? Are you a man or woman of reason? And when you operate in this realm, personalities become on one level insignificant. Listening not to me, Heraclitus said, right, but to the logos, it would be wise to agree. If I can give you reasons that stand up in the broad common world of knowledge, you would be wise to agree with me, even if you don't like me, my dog, or my politics. But you would be a fool to listen to me if all I had were opinions offered on my own idiosyncratic experiences, even if you just loved me, loved my dog, and loved my politics. If I were an idiotes and a dreamer. In the act of thinking, self-awareness wakes up from the dreams of particularity to the waking world of the one and the many, the same and the different. And we realize an essential part of our humanity in realizing the logos. Now, many people can listen to the logos and key into the common patterns, like my example of the doctor. But in logic, we don't just try to do this in one particular area. We don't just try to think, but we try to think about thinking, right? We want to think about thinking, not just think, but think about what it means to think. That's what logic is. And in particular, we think about the kind of thinking that gives reasons for what it thinks, which we usually call arguments. And in thinking about arguments, the main thing is to think about whether the argument is a good one or not. In logic, we learn to say whether the argument is valid or invalid. And here you can begin to see how logic relates to philosophy. The Greek philosopher Aristotle, who was the famous student of the philosopher Plato, who was himself a student of the infamous Socrates, wrote the first textbook on logic in the 4th century BCE, which he called the Organon. Now in Greek, an organon was an instrument, an implement, or a tool, like a shovel, or a pick, or a hammer. Right? And in general, it meant an instrument or tool for doing something. Now, it also meant like having a set of tools. So a carpenter would have an organon, a sort of tool chest for his carpentry. Now, it also has the sense of a set of methods or principles used for investigation into a subject area. Right? So logic can be viewed as the tools of thought, the equipment of thought, the principles that can be used to organize thought and prepare it for any form of intellectual inquiry. Right? Whether you do math, whether you do biology, whether you do physics, sociology, history, all of them have to use logic. Right? So logic is necessary for doing philosophy, like it's necessary for doing all other kinds of things. But it's not sufficient. If there is no logic, there is no philosophy. But philosophy is far more than logic. We might then say, just as all dogs are animals, but not all animals are dogs. So all philosophers are logicians, but not all logicians are philosophers. Logic is concerned with the form of thought, but not with its content. And that's a crucial point to see. That's both its power and what makes it not philosophy. Logic can look at any argument and tell whether its form is good or bad. But the content of the form, what you're reasoning about, that's where philosophy takes flight. And what is philosophy, you might ask? What are we doing logic to prepare for? Well, remember, it all begins with that gap, with the wonder and the terror, and with seeing that what your culture has told you might not be exactly what's true about the way things are. Right? And then you're filled with questions, and then you begin to reason, and then you begin to argue, and you become what is called a lover of wisdom. Right? And when you love wisdom, you fall in love with the knowledge of what is most real, so you can know how to live and act in the light of that reality. Right? And to want to have knowledge of that, to want to know what is most real about being human and how we should live our lives, that's what it means to be a philosopher and a lover of wisdom. But logic is just how we get in shape to do that. Right? It's how we begin. If we can't argue properly or know what a good argument is, then how can we give reasons that are good ones? And how can we begin to think about all the wonder and terror we find in the beauty and strangeness of the earth? Thank you for your kind attention, and I'll be back with you soon with another one of these funny little videos.